The snow crunched beneath Jake's worn boots as he trudged up the forgotten path to his father's cabin. At 17, the weight of inheritance felt heavier than the backpack slung over his narrow shoulders. 8 years of silence, ended by a lawyer's letter and a rusty key. Inside, dust particles danced in the few rays of light that penetrated the grime-covered windows, illuminating a life Jake barely knew. The cabin smelled of pine and neglect, a painful reminder of the father who vanished from his life without explanation. His loyal retriever, Rusty, whined and scratched frantically at a loose floorboard in the corner, his excited bark echoing through the abandoned rooms. As Jake pried up the weathered wood, his breath caught in his throat. Nestled in darkness lay a collection of small, glittering stones that seemed to capture the mountain sunset in their depths. Would these mysterious gems be the key to understanding the father who abandoned him? Could they truly be worth millions, as the appraiser later whispered in disbelief? And who were the shadowy figures now watching the cabin from the tree line? Jake's hands trembled as he lifted one of the stones, its cool surface catching the dim light in a burst of deep blue and purple. The discovery felt significant beyond the mere finding of valuable objects. It was as if his father had left a message encoded in these glittering fragments. The cabin itself seemed to hold its breath as Jake examined his find. A simple wooden box containing 24 stones, each unique in its cut and color, but sharing the same otherworldly luminescence. Rusty settled beside him, muzzle resting on paws, brown eyes fixed on his young master with unwavering devotion. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, whispering through the pine trees surrounding the isolated cabin. Jake hadn't wanted to come here, had fought against accepting anything from the man who walked away without a backward glance, leaving him and his mother to struggle through years of near poverty. But his mother's recent death from cancer had left him alone in the world, and the cabin represented his only inheritance, his only home. He carefully returned the stones to their hiding place, securing the floorboard with trembling hands. Tomorrow he would need to venture into town for supplies. The cabin was habitable but barely, with no electricity and questionable plumbing. As night fell across the mountains, Jake unrolled his sleeping bag near the stone fireplace and managed to start a small fire with the aged logs stacked nearby. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, illuminating faded photographs he hadn't noticed earlier. His father, younger and smiling, standing on a mountainside with scientific equipment. In another, his father shook hands with men in expensive suits, their expressions unreadable in the flickering light. Rusty growled softly at the darkness beyond the windows, sensing something Jake couldn't see. The boy pulled his dog closer, taking comfort in the animal's warmth as questions multiplied in his mind. Why had his father chosen this remote location? What were these stones that seemed too perfect, too luminous to be ordinary gems? And why did he feel, with increasing certainty, that he was being watched? Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain wilderness and dreams of blue stones that burned like cold fire in his hands. Morning would bring decisions that would alter the course of his life forever, though Jake couldn't possibly know that as he finally drifted into uneasy slumber, one hand resting protectively on the rough floorboard concealing his mysterious inheritance. The mountain town of Pinecrest hadn't changed much in the 8 years since Jake had last visited with his mother, seeking answers they never found. The main street still consisted of a handful of weathered storefronts, including Harmon's Jewelry and Watch Repair, its brass bell announcing Jake's entrance. The elderly jeweler adjusted his spectacles as Jake carefully placed 3 of the smallest stones on the counter, a strategic decision to test their value without revealing his entire find. "Where did you get these, son?" Harmon whispered after a prolonged examination under his loupe, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he turned each stone under the bright desk lamp. The jeweler's reaction confirmed Jake's suspicions. These weren't ordinary rocks collected by an amateur. When Harmon mentioned a figure that made Jake's knees buckle, the reality of his situation began to crystallize. These are extremely rare chromium-bearing sapphires with exceptional clarity, but there's something unusual about their composition. Harmon explained, curiosity and caution mingling in his voice. I'd need to send them to a specialist to be certain of their full value, but conservatively speaking, just these 3 stones could change your life. Life-changing money was something Jake had only dreamed about during the difficult years after his father's disappearance. His mother had worked double shifts as a hospital nurse, the constant exhaustion slowly dimming her once bright spirit. They'd moved between increasingly smaller apartments as medical bills accumulated, his mother's illness initially disguised as simple fatigue from overwork. Jake had abandoned his own college ambitions, taking night shifts at a warehouse while finishing high school online. The stones now represented a bewildering possibility of freedom, yet they also pulled him deeper into the mystery of his father's life and disappearance. Back at the cabin, with Harmon's preliminary valuations spinning in his mind, Jake began a more thorough exploration. Behind a loose section of knotty pine paneling, he discovered a cache of leather-bound journals, their pages filled with his father's distinctive handwriting, diagrams of geological formations, and chemical formulas that meant nothing to Jake. Dates in the margins revealed entries spanning years, continuing long after his father had supposedly vanished. April 18th. Jake read aloud to Rusty, who sat attentively beside him as late afternoon light slanted through the windows. The Blue Mountain Formation continues to produce specimens with the unusual chromium-vanadium signature. If my analysis is correct, these aren't just gemstones, but potentially the key to sustainable energy storage at unprecedented density. The technical language grew increasingly complex, but between scientific observations were more personal reflections. I miss them more each day. One entry read, "Jake would be starting high school now. Does he hate me for leaving? Would he understand that I had no choice?" Each page revealed a man Jake barely recognized, a dedicated geologist who had apparently made a discovery significant enough to upend his family life and force him into some kind of hiding. Night fell as Jake continued reading, his father's voice emerging from the yellowed pages, both familiar and strange. He set aside the journal only when his eyes burned with fatigue, his mind racing with questions that only seemed to multiply with each revelation. The stones hidden beneath the floorboard weren't just valuable gems, but pieces of a scientific puzzle that had consumed his father's life and somehow led to his disappearance. Rusty's sudden growl at the window reminded Jake that perhaps he wasn't the only one interested in his father's legacy. The black SUV first appeared on the 3rd morning, parked just beyond the property line where the dirt road met the county highway, its tinted windows revealing nothing of its occupants. Jake observed it through his father's old binoculars, tension building in his chest as Rusty paced nervously by the front door. The vehicle remained for hours, motionless except for occasional puffs of exhaust in the cool mountain air, a silent sentinel that made Jake's skin crawl with the certainty of being watched. He was contemplating his limited options when a knock at the back door startled him so severely he nearly dropped the binoculars. Rusty barked once, but without aggression, his tail offering a tentative wag as Jake cautiously approached the door. On the small back porch stood a woman who had to be well into her 70s, silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her weathered face creased with a smile that couldn't quite mask her concern. "You're Robert's boy," she stated rather than asked, looking Jake over with piercing blue eyes. "I'm Martha Holloway, your nearest neighbor, though that's still 2 miles through those woods. Thought I'd better come check on you before those vultures did." She nodded toward the distant SUV as she stepped inside, carrying a covered dish that smelled of homemade bread. Over coffee brewed on the wood stove, Martha revealed her connection to his father. "Robert and I go back 30 years, she said, her use of present tense not lost on Jake. "He helped save my property from foreclosure after my Harold passed, and I've kept an eye on this place while he's been away." Martha's hesitation confirmed Jake's growing suspicion that his father's disappearance wasn't as straightforward as abandonment. "Your father is a brilliant man who discovered something extraordinary in these mountains," she continued, lowering her voice despite their isolation. "People with money and influence wanted to control it, use it for purposes Robert couldn't abide. When threats didn't work, they tried buying him out, offering millions." She paused, watching Jake's expression carefully. "When nothing swayed him, they made it clear his family would suffer next, That's why he left, son. Not because he didn't love you. Jake struggled to reconcile this version of his father with the man who had vanished without explanation, leaving them to face poverty and his mother's illness alone. Why didn't he ever contact us? My mother died believing he'd simply stopped loving us. Martha's eyes filled with tears. He tried to protect you the only way he knew how, by severing all connections. The people after him, they don't play by any rules you'd recognize. As if summoned by her warning, the cabin's ancient telephone rang, its shrill bell shattering the moment. Jake answered with a hesitant hello, met with several seconds of silence before a man's voice, smooth and cultured, responded, "Jacob Miller, how nice to find you settling into your inheritance. I represented some of your father's former business associates, who would be very interested in purchasing the property, given its sentimental value to their organization." The caller's tone remained pleasant, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. "I'm not interested in selling," Jake replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "That's disappointing to hear," the voice continued without missing a beat. "Especially given how dangerous these mountains can be for someone unfamiliar with their hazards. Accidents happen so easily in such remote locations." The line went dead, leaving Jake holding the receiver as Martha watched with knowing dread in her eyes. Through the front window, the black SUV's engine started, though it remained in position, a silent promise that this was merely the opening move in a game Jake was only beginning to understand. The journals became Jake's obsession in the days that followed, each entry pulling him deeper into his father's hidden life. He read by lantern light late into the night, the cabin's shadows seeming to hold secrets of their own as Rusty kept vigilant watch by the door. The technical language grew more comprehensible as Jake referenced geology textbooks he'd found on a dusty shelf, slowly piecing together the significance of what his father called the Blue Mountain Formation. According to the journals, his father had stumbled upon the deposit during a routine geological survey for a university research project. Initial samples reveal a previously unclassified mineral compound with extraordinary properties. One early entry read, "The crystalline structures exhibit unprecedented energy conductivity and storage potential, possibly representing the missing link in renewable energy technology." Jake found himself transported to the past through his father's vivid descriptions, imagining the moment of discovery when Robert Miller, kneeling on a remote mountainside, realized what he had found. The ethical struggle began almost immediately. Vertex Mining representatives visited campus today, read an entry dated a year before his disappearance. "They've caught wind of my preliminary findings, though I've been deliberately vague in my published papers. Their offer of funding comes with strings that would give them exclusive rights to any discoveries." The figure they mentioned was staggering, but something about their eagerness disturbs me. Later entries chronicled mounting pressure, as his father attempted to secure the discovery through proper scientific channels while protecting the pristine mountain ecosystem. "The deposit exists in perfect harmony with the surrounding environment," his father wrote. "Conventional mining would destroy not just the mountain but contaminate the watershed that sustains 5 communities downstream. There must be a way to harness this discovery without destruction." The painful decision to disappear unfolded gradually across tear-stained pages. Veiled threats today about my family's safety. A photograph of Jake at baseball practice was left on my desk, followed by a call asking if I'd reconsidered their generous offer. I can no longer put those I love at risk. The most recent entry was dated just 6 months ago. "The synthetic replication experiments are showing promise. If I can reproduce the mineral's properties in the lab, the natural deposit could remain untouched. This could change everything, but time is running out. I sense they're closing in again." Jake's hands trembled as he processed the implications. His father hadn't abandoned them but had gone into hiding to protect them while continuing his research somewhere. But where? The answer came as Jake examined the inside cover of the final journal, noticing a slight bulge beneath the end paper. Carefully peeling back the aged glue, he discovered a folded map of the surrounding mountains with cryptic notations and coordinates marked in his father's precise handwriting. One location was circled multiple times with a notation that simply read, Lab Alpha. This wasn't just a map of the valuable deposit, Jake realized, but something potentially more valuable. A guide to where his father might have continued his work in secret. Outside, the distant crunch of tires on gravel announced the black SUV's return, closer to the cabin this time. Jake carefully refolded the map and tucked it into his boot. Whatever his father had been working on, powerful people were still hunting for it, and now Jake was the only one who might find it first. But the knowledge carried its own burden, forcing Jake to confront a question he wasn't prepared to answer. If he found his father's research, what would he do with it? Martha arrived the following morning with a thermos of coffee and a determined set to her jaw. Her ancient pickup truck parked behind the cabin where it couldn't be seen from the road. "We're going to see Henry today," she announced, pouring steaming coffee into a chipped mug and sliding it across the table to Jake. "If anyone can make sense of Robert's research, it's him." They departed through the back trail, Rusty trotting ahead as if he understood the need for discretion. The path wound through dense pines before descending into a narrow valley, where a small cabin sat nestled against a cliff face, smoke curling from its stone chimney. The man who opened the door stood tall despite his advanced years, his body lean and weathered like an old cedar, eyes sharp beneath bushy white brows. "So you're Robert's boy," he said, voice gravelly from years of dust in mining tunnels. "'Bout time you showed up." Henry's cabin was a curious blend of rustic living and scientific laboratory, with handmade furniture sharing space with specialized equipment and geological specimens lining rough-hewn shelves. Jake placed 3 of the stones on the scratched wooden table, watching as Henry's expression transformed from gruff interest to astonished reverence. "Sweet mercy," he whispered, lifting one stone with trembling fingers. He actually found them. For the next hour, Henry explained what Jake's father had discovered, translating complex science into terms Jake could grasp. "These aren't just ordinary gems," Henry said, holding a stone to the light where it glowed with an inner fire. "They're what some old-timers called mountain sapphires, but they're something entirely unique to this range. Your father was the first to recognize their true significance." Henry retrieved a battered microscope, inviting Jake to observe the stone's structure. "See those lattice patterns? They can conduct and store electrical energy more efficiently than anything on Earth. A single stone this size could power a small town for months with virtually no degradation. In the right applications, they could revolutionize renewable energy." The old man's voice dropped lower. "But that's not all they can do. Your father discovered they have applications for advanced computing, medical technology, even space exploration. The potential value isn't just in the stones themselves, but in the technologies they make possible. We're talking trillions, not millions." The magnitude of his father's discovery began to sink in. "Is that why those people are after them? For the money?" Henry exchanged a knowing look with Martha. "Money's just the beginning. These stones represent power in every sense of the word. Control the source, control the future. Vertex mining is just the public face of interests that span governments and industries." He sighed heavily, the weight of knowledge evident in his stooped shoulders. "Your father recognized the danger immediately. That's why he focused on finding ways to synthesize the minerals rather than extract them. He believed there had to be a way to harness their properties without destroying the mountain." Jake produced the hidden map, watching Henry's eyes widen in recognition. "Lab Alpha," the old man whispered. "So he did establish a secondary research site. We'd suspected as much, but Robert was careful to protect those he involved." Rusty, who had been exploring the cabin, suddenly returned to Jake's side, leaning against his leg as if sensing the gravity of the conversation. Henry studied Jake's face carefully. "You've got your father's eyes, same way of looking at a problem. I'll help you make sense of his research, but you need to understand what you're getting into. The people hunting these stones have resources beyond imagination and no moral boundaries whatsoever." Jake thought of his mother's struggle, his father's sacrifice, the years of confusion and resentment. "I need to find him," he said simply, "or at least finish what he started." Henry nodded slowly. "Then we begin tomorrow. Tonight, we make preparations." They're watching the cabin, but they don't know about this place yet. Best keep it that way. As darkness fell across the valley, Jake realized he had taken his first step into a world his father had tried to shield him from, a world where knowledge was the most valuable and dangerous resource of all. Jake returned to the cabin late that evening to find two sleek vehicles parked in the clearing, the black SUV now accompanied by a luxury sedan with tinted windows. Rusty growled low in his throat as three figures emerged from the shadows of the porch, their silhouettes crisp against the cabin's warm interior light that someone had presumptively turned on in Jake's absence. The man who stepped forward exuded practiced charm, his tailored suit incongruous against the rustic setting, hand extended in a gesture of forced familiarity. "Jacob Miller, I presume?" "William Davis, Executive Vice President of Community Relations at Vertex Mining Corporation. We've been so looking forward to meeting you." Jake reluctantly shook the offered hand, noting the cold firmness of the grip and the calculating assessment in Davis's eyes. Behind him stood a woman with a tablet and a broad-shouldered man whose jacket bulged suspiciously, suggesting he served purposes beyond corporate representation. Inside, Davis moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding any room he entered, settling into Jake's father's chair without invitation. "We'll be direct, Mr. Miller. Vertex has had an interest in this region's development potential for some time. Your father's property represents a crucial piece in our vision for a luxury mountain resort that would bring jobs and prosperity to this economically depressed area." The woman produced architectural renderings showing gleaming buildings nestled harmoniously among the trees, a fantasy of sustainable tourism that bore no resemblance to Vertex's reputation for extraction and exploitation. Davis named a figure that made Jake's breath catch, an amount that would pay for the finest medical care his mother could no longer benefit from, 4 years at any university, and financial security beyond anything he'd imagined. "All we require is the property and any research materials your father may have left behind, as a matter of environmental compliance, of course." Davis's smile never reached his eyes. "You'd be free to begin a new life anywhere you choose, unburdened by this isolated cabin and its complicated history." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting in its simplicity. Jake thought of all the nights he'd watched his mother count pennies at the kitchen table, the scholarships he'd had to decline, the weight of perpetual financial insecurity. Yet beneath Davis's polished veneer lurked something predatory, a calculated manipulation that made Jake instinctively wary. "The property has sentimental value," Jake said carefully, watching Davis's expression for any reaction. "My father spent years working here." Something flickered briefly across Davis's features, a momentary crack in his professional facade. Yes, Robert Miller was quite devoted to his geological surveys. We respected his dedication, if not always his conclusions. The woman cleared her throat softly, and Davis immediately adjusted his approach. "Take some time to consider our offer. We're prepared to increase it by 15% as a gesture of goodwill." He placed a business card on the table, heavy stock with embossed lettering that caught the lamplight. "We'll expect your answer within 48 hours. This is a time-sensitive opportunity, I'm afraid." The implied threat lingered after they departed, their vehicle's headlights cutting through the darkness as they descended the mountain road. Jake stood in the doorway long after they'd gone. Rusty pressed against his leg in silent solidarity. The money would solve every practical problem in his life, offering an escape from the legacy of hardship that had defined his existence since his father's disappearance. Yet Henry's words echoed in his mind, warnings about power and control that transcended financial gain. Jake closed the door and leaned against it, the business card heavy in his pocket, its promise of wealth balanced against the growing certainty that his father had sacrificed everything to keep his discovery out of Vertex's hands. The choice before him seemed impossible, a decision between the security he'd always craved and a truth his father had deemed worth protecting at any cost. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the pines as Jake made his way back to Henry's cabin, the business card from Davis burning in his pocket like a hot coal. Henry was already awake, tending a small garden of hardy mountain vegetables, his gnarled hands moving with surprising gentleness among the plants. One look at Jake's troubled expression told the old man everything he needed to know. They came with their silver tongues and golden promises, did they? Henry asked, straightening with a wince as his aged joints protested. Inside, over a breakfast of strong coffee and cornbread, Jake recounted the meeting with Davis while Henry listened in stony silence, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. When Jake finished, Henry pushed away from the table and retrieved a worn photo album from a shelf. Before you even consider their offer, there's something you need to see. The album contained newspaper clippings and photographs documenting Vertex's history across 3 decades and multiple mountain communities. Images of pristine valleys transformed into gaping pits, dried-up stream beds choked with chemical residue, and abandoned towns with boarded storefronts told a story no corporate brochure would feature. Pinewood Valley, 60 miles north, Henry said, pointing to before and after photos of a once thriving community now reduced to a ghost town. They promised jobs and prosperity there too, 3 years of employment followed by a lifetime of poisoned wells and unusable land. When the lawsuits came, Vertex dissolved that subsidiary and reformed under a new corporate entity, leaving no one to hold accountable. Page after page revealed the same pattern across Appalachia, the Rockies, and beyond, communities seduced by economic promises only to be abandoned when the extraction was complete. Your father documented all of this while researching the potential impact of mining in our region. That's when he realized what his discovery could mean in the wrong hands. The stones themselves are valuable, but the deposit they come from represents energy independence that would threaten billions in fossil fuel investments. Vertex doesn't want to build a resort. They want to ensure no one else can access what your father found. Jake thought about the money, the freedom it represented. Measured against the devastation documented in Henry's album, his decision crystallized with surprising clarity. I need to call Davis. Henry watched him carefully. Once you refuse them, there's no going back. They'll come at you with everything they have. Jake's jaw set in a stubborn line reminiscent of his father. Then we'd better be ready. The call was brief. Davis answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting by the phone. Jake declined the offer without preamble, his voice steadier than he expected. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds before Davis responded, his cultivated charm giving way to something colder. I had hoped you would prove more reasonable than your father, Jacob. A shame you've inherited his misguided idealism, along with his property rights. The shift in tone confirmed everything Henry had warned about. Perhaps you should ask yourself why a simple vacation property would warrant such a generous offer, or what your father might have hidden there that would justify our interest. Jake's blood ran cold at the direct reference. I don't know what you're talking about. Davis's laugh held no humor. Don't insult us both with denials. The blue stones have always been our primary interest, as your father well knew. They belong in professional hands, not with some teenager playing treasure hunter. Before Jake could respond, Davis continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Our offer expires now, along with our patience. What follows is entirely your responsibility. The line went dead, leaving Jake staring at the receiver. Henry nodded grimly. You've made a powerful enemy today, son, but you've honored your father's sacrifice. Jake placed the phone down slowly. They know about the stones specifically. They must have been watching the cabin when I took them to Harmon. Henry's expression darkened further. Then we have even less time than I thought. We need to find your father's research before they take more direct action. And son, from this point forward, trust no one in town you don't absolutely have to. Darkness was settling over the mountains by the time Jake and Rusty made their way back to the cabin, having spent the day with Henry studying his father's research notes. The first sign of trouble came when Rusty froze at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised and a low growl building in his throat. Jake instinctively pulled the dog behind a thick stand of pines, scanning the area before approaching further. The cabin door hung askew on broken hinges, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Inside, destruction greeted him like a physical blow. Drawers had been emptied onto the floor, Furniture overturned and slashed open, floorboards pried up in numerous places throughout the cabin. The methodical nature of the search was evident. This was no random vandalism, but a deliberate and thorough attempt to find something specific. Rusty whimpered as he picked his way through the chaos, sniffing anxiously at upended furniture and scattered possessions. Jake moved instinctively to the loose floorboard where he had first discovered the stones, finding it already torn away, the hiding place exposed and empty. A cold wave of relief washed over him as he remembered removing the stones days earlier, transferring them to Henry's cabin for safekeeping. More concerning was the hiding place behind the wall panel where his father's journals had been stored. Jake's pulse raced as he approached the section of wooden paneling, noting with growing dread that it appeared undisturbed among the surrounding destruction. The intruders had searched every obvious location but somehow missed this critical hiding spot. The journals remained secure in their niche, though Jake knew their safety was temporary at best. The sound of tires on gravel sent Jake dropping into a crouch, signaling Rusty to remain silent as Martha's pickup rolled cautiously into view. The elderly woman moved with surprising agility as she hurried toward the cabin, face lined with worry that deepened when she saw the splintered door. "Thank God you're all right," she whispered, embracing Jake briefly before surveying the destruction. "I came as soon as I could. They were here for hours." 3 men in dark suits methodically tearing the place apart while another kept watch from the SUV. She described how the men had carried equipment for scanning the walls and floors, spending particular time around the fireplace and in what had been Robert's small office. They were like machines, Jake, communicating through earpieces, following some kind of search protocol. This wasn't their first operation of this kind. Jake quickly gathered the journals from their hiding place, stuffing them into his backpack along with the few personal items that had survived the destruction. "They'll be back when they realize they missed something," he said, moving with new urgency. "I need to get these somewhere safe." Martha nodded, understanding immediately. "You can't stay here tonight. They might have left surveillance devices. Come to my place until we figure out next steps." As they prepared to leave, Rusty suddenly trotted to the ransacked kitchen, pawing insistently at something on the floor. Jake found the dog had uncovered an overlooked detail among the chaos, a small business card that had fallen beneath the stove. Unlike the one Davis had given him, this card bore no company name, only a phone number printed in simple black text. Jake pocketed it without comment, another piece in the growing puzzle of his father's life. Martha touched his arm gently as they surveyed the violated space one last time. "Your father knew this might happen someday. It's why he prepared contingencies, spread his research across multiple locations. These people may have resources, but Robert was always thinking 3 steps ahead." Jake nodded, finding unexpected comfort in the connection to his father's foresight. The cabin that had briefly been a link to his past was now compromised, yet as they slipped away through the darkening forest, Jake felt a strange sense of his father's presence guiding him forward. Whatever Robert Miller had discovered was significant enough to warrant this level of pursuit, and Jake was now irrevocably entangled in its mystery. The knowledge brought danger, but also a growing determination to understand the truth his father had deemed worth such sacrifice. The following morning found Jake, Henry, and Rusty returning cautiously to the cabin property, approaching through the dense forest rather than the main road to avoid detection. The air hung heavy with the threat of rain as they skirted the cabin itself, making their way to the dilapidated tool shed that stood several yards behind the main structure. "Your father's latest journal mentioned measurements and angles," Henry whispered as they examined the seemingly ordinary outbuilding. "The reference to the shed's shadow marking the way at summer solstice has to mean something." Jake consulted the journal pages, studying diagrams that had initially appeared to be simple astronomical observations. Understanding dawned as he aligned the drawings with the shed's position relative to the morning sun. He wasn't tracking stars. Jake realized he was creating a solar alignment system that would only work on specific dates. Henry nodded approvingly. "Your father was clever. Even if someone found these notes, they'd need to be here on exactly the right day to make sense of them." Fortunately, Henry's decades of mining experience made the puzzle solvable without waiting for perfect solar alignment. The old man examined the shed's crude wooden floor with expert eyes, tapping methodically until a hollow sound revealed what they sought. Beneath a false section of flooring lay a steel trapdoor with a sophisticated electronic lock, incongruously modern against the weathered surroundings. "Biometric," Henry muttered, examining the small scanner built into the lock mechanism. Jake stared at it in dismay, certain their search had hit an insurmountable obstacle, when Henry surprised him by pressing Jake's hand against the scanner. The lock hummed briefly before emitting a soft click as the mechanism disengaged. "He programmed it for your handprint," Henry explained, noting Jake's confusion. "Your father always intended for you to find this place someday." A narrow metal ladder descended into darkness below. The space they entered left both of them momentarily speechless. The underground laboratory, roughly the size of the cabin above, contained equipment that would have been at home in a university research facility. Countertops of polished steel held specialized microscopes, centrifuges, and devices Jake couldn't identify. One entire wall was dedicated to a computer system running complex simulations, the monitors displaying molecular structures slowly rotating in 3 dimensions. "He built all this in secret," Jake whispered, running his fingers over a workstation where handwritten notes were still arranged as if his father had just stepped away momentarily. Henry moved reverently through the space, examining the sophisticated setup with undisguised admiration. "This represents years of work and ingenuity. Your father created a research environment that would have cost millions in an institutional setting." The lab's centerpiece was a sealed glass chamber containing what appeared to be artificial growing medium with small blue, crystalline formations embedded throughout. Attached monitors displayed ongoing measurements of the formation's growth rates and energy outputs. He was trying to create synthetic versions of the stones, Henry realized, examining the apparatus. Growing them rather than mining them. Jake discovered a comprehensive geological survey of the mountain range labeled Blue Mountain Formation, with one section highlighted and marked with a warning. "Primary deposit location. Must remain undisturbed at all costs." The detailed maps revealed why the specific location was so critical, showing how the mineral vein intersected with the region's primary watershed. Conventional mining would release compounds that would poison the water supply for 5 counties, Jake read from his father's notes. Vertex knows this but considers it an acceptable cost of extraction. The most recent notes detailed promising breakthroughs in the synthetic creation process. Sample 37 demonstrates 82% of natural specimen properties with significantly improved stability, one entry read. Estimate 6 to 8 months until viable commercial application if current growth trajectory maintains. The timeline corresponded with the most recent journal entries, suggesting his father had been making significant progress just before Jake inherited the cabin. A sudden notification from the computer system broke their concentration. A message appearing on the main screen. "External security perimeter breached. Multiple intruders detected approaching from North Access Road. Surveillance feeds activated, showing 3 black SUVs making their way up the mountain." "They've found us," Henry said grimly. "We need to take what we can and get out now." Jake grabbed his father's most recent research journals and a small case containing synthetic stone samples, heart racing as the security system continued its countdown to unwelcome visitors. As Jake frantically gathered research materials, his elbow struck a metal container bolted to the wall beside the main computer terminal. The impact caused a small panel to slide open, revealing a sophisticated data drive and a handwritten note that simply read, "For Jake." With security alerts intensifying around them, Jake connected the drive to the computer system, hands trembling as a video file automatically launched on the main screen. His father's face filled the monitor, older than Jake remembered, lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, but unmistakably the man who had vanished from his life 8 years ago. "Jake." The recording began, his father's voice sending a shock of recognition through him. "If you're watching this, then you found the lab and likely discovered the stones as well. I've programmed this message to be accessible only to your biometric signature. There's so much I need to explain, and so little time. Henry moved protectively to the ladder, keeping watch as Jake stood transfixed before his father's image. First, you need to know that leaving you and your mother was the hardest decision I've ever made. I didn't abandon you, son. I left to protect you. His father's voice cracked with emotion before he composed himself. Shortly after discovering the Blue Mountain Formation, I realized the implications of what I'd found. These minerals represent the most significant energy storage breakthrough in scientific history, capable of revolutionizing renewable energy implementation worldwide. But extracting them using conventional methods would devastate the entire ecosystem and watershed. The recording continued as Robert Miller explained how Vertex Mining had initially approached him as research partners, their interest turning predatory when they realized the potential value. When I refused to disclose the deposit's location or sign over rights, they began making threats. First professional, then personal. The day I found surveillance photos of you and your mother on my windshield, I knew they wouldn't stop at intimidation. Jake watched as his father detailed his impossible choice: to either reveal the location and become complicit in environmental destruction, or disappear to continue his research in secret. I established this lab to find an alternative, a way to synthesize the minerals without mining. If successful, the natural deposit could remain untouched, while the technology could still benefit humanity. Security alerts flashed with increasing urgency as the recording continued, showing the Vertex vehicles now halfway up the access road. The final portion of the message contained critical information delivered with urgent precision. I've nearly perfected the synthetic process. The remaining research is at Lab Omega, whose coordinates are encrypted in the drive you're holding. Trust Henry and Martha. They've been my only allies through this. And Jake, be careful. Vertex is just the public face of much more powerful interests who will stop at nothing to control this discovery. The screen went dark as the security system announced, perimeter breach imminent. 3 minutes to arrival. Tears streamed down Jake's face as Henry gripped his shoulder firmly. We need to move now, son. Your father's message isn't the only thing we need to save. They escaped through a secondary exit that emerged within a dense thicket of mountain laurel 300 yards from the cabin, the sounds of vehicles and shouting men fading behind them as they made their way through terrain too rugged for Vertex's SUVs. Martha's home provided temporary sanctuary, her isolated farmhouse situated in a small valley with clear sightlines in all directions, making surprise approaches impossible. Jake sat on the porch that evening, turning one of the blue stones over in his palm as the setting sun caught its depths, igniting flashes of cobalt and violet that seemed to pulse with inner life. 8 years of bitter resentment collided with his father's recorded words, creating a storm of conflicting emotions that left Jake feeling hollow and uncertain. He was trying to do the right thing. Jake acknowledged quietly to Rusty, who rested his head on the boy's knee with unwavering loyalty. But he left us struggling for years. Mom worked herself to exhaustion, took on debt for treatments that didn't save her. All that time, these stones were sitting there, any one of which could have paid for everything she needed. The unfairness of it burned like acid, even as Jake recognized the impossible position his father had faced. From Martha's kitchen window came the glow of lamplight where she and Henry pored over maps and documents, planning their next move while giving Jake space to process his thoughts. The practical reality of his situation presented an equally troubling dilemma. Harmon had offered a small fortune for just 3 stones, enough to secure Jake's future, pay off his mother's medical debts, and provide the education he'd been forced to defer. Using the stones as simple gemstones would solve every financial problem that had defined his existence since his father's disappearance. Yet doing so would inevitably draw attention, potentially exposing the source to the very interests his father had sacrificed everything to thwart. Through binoculars borrowed from Martha, Jake could see increased activity on the surrounding ridgelines, Vertex employees in hiking gear conducting what they would claim were environmental surveys if questioned. Their systematic movements revealed their true purpose, a methodical grid search of the mountain range. They were closing in, resources expanding as the corporation committed fully to locating the deposit his father had kept hidden. The data drive in Jake's pocket contained the coordinates to Lab Omega, potentially the location of his father himself, alive and continuing his research. The possibility that his father might still be alive sent waves of confusion through Jake's already turbulent emotions. What would a reunion even look like after 8 years of absence? Could understanding truly overcome abandonment, regardless of the justification? Morning brought the necessity of supplies for their journey to Lab Omega, forcing Jake to venture into town despite the risks. Martha suggested a route through back roads and introduced him to her nephew, Connor, a taciturn local with a deep distrust of outsiders who agreed to drive Jake in his weathered pickup truck. The town of Pinecrest appeared even more diminished in daylight than it had during Jake's brief visit to the jeweler. Boarded storefronts lined the main street, with only essential businesses still operating in a community clearly struggling to survive. While Connor collected supplies, Jake found himself in the town's only diner, a cramped establishment where conversations hushed noticeably when he entered. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes but a genuine smile, recognized him immediately. "You're Robert Miller's boy," she said, pouring coffee without being asked. "Heard you were back at the old cabin. I'm Diane. Your dad used to grade papers here every Thursday. Always left textbook-sized tips." Her warmth created an opening, and soon Jake found himself joined by an elderly man who introduced himself as Frank Townsend, former mayor and current town council member. "Your father understood this community better than most who grew up here," Frank said, voice kept low as he glanced toward another table where 2 men in crisp outdoor gear stood out among the locals. He saw what Vertex's promises really meant before the rest of us caught on. Frank explained how Vertex had appeared 5 years ago, initially proposing a small-scale operation that promised 40 local jobs in a town desperate for employment. They bought the old Wilson property on the North Ridge, claiming it was for preliminary environmental studies. 2 years later, they revealed plans for an operation 10 times the original size, requiring massive water usage from the watershed we all depend on. The controversy had divided Pinecrest between those desperate enough for jobs to accept any terms and those who recognized the long-term environmental costs. Your father testified at county hearings, presented research showing how similar operations had affected other communities, made himself mighty unpopular with folks needing work, but time's proven him right. The few jobs they've created go mostly to specialists brought in from outside, while our water's already showing contamination from their preliminary work. As they spoke, others gradually joined their table, each sharing pieces of the community's struggle. Sarah Jenkins, the local schoolteacher, described declining enrollment as younger families moved away seeking stability. "We're down to 1 classroom for all elementary grades combined." Vertex promised community development funds that never materialized once they secured their permits. Mike Harmon, the jeweler who had evaluated Jake's stones, appeared briefly, communicating with a meaningful glance and subtle headshake that he had kept their interaction confidential. The most revealing conversation came from Thomas Reed, a former Vertex employee who had quit over ethical concerns. "They have geological surveys identifying multiple potential extraction sites across these mountains," he confided. "But there's one particular formation they're obsessed with locating. They've had teams searching for years based on fragmented research they acquired. Some mineral composition supposedly capable of revolutionizing energy storage technology." Jake maintained his composure despite the direct reference to his father's discovery, asking questions that revealed how deeply the corporation's pursuit had affected the region. Martha's kitchen table became their war room that night, covered with Jake's father's journals, scientific papers, and the data from the drive they'd recovered. Henry hunched over the materials, his mining engineer's perspective providing crucial context to the complex geological and chemical information. Jake struggled initially with the technical terminology, but hours of focused study began to reveal the brilliance of his father's work. "Your father named them Caerolite," Henry explained, referencing one of the earliest journals. "From the Latin for blue but also sky, suggesting their potential for addressing atmospheric carbon. The full implications of the discovery unfolded as they analyzed the research chronologically. What Robert Miller had stumbled upon wasn't simply a new gemstone, but a previously unknown mineral compound with extraordinary properties. The crystalline structure can absorb and store electrical energy with nearly zero degradation or loss. Jake read aloud from his father's notes. A single pound of refined kerylite could potentially store enough energy to power an average home for 50 years. Henry nodded grimly. Now you understand why Vertex wants this deposit so badly. It would render conventional battery technology obsolete overnight and revolutionize renewable energy implementation globally. Solar and wind power's biggest limitation has always been storage capacity. This solves that problem definitively. The most significant revelation came as they decoded the research on the natural formation process. The kerylite deposit formed under uniquely perfect conditions over millions of years, Henry explained, pointing to cross-sectional diagrams of the mountain's geological composition. The specific combination of minerals, pressure, groundwater chemistry, and even the mountain's unusual magnetic properties created something that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth, as far as your father could determine. This uniqueness made the deposit invaluable, but also dangerously vulnerable. Jake's father had documented how conventional mining approaches would inevitably fracture the delicate hydrogeological systems that maintained the mountain's ecological balance. A standard extraction operation would release compounds that would bind with the groundwater, Jake read, comprehension dawning. The resulting contamination would flow through the entire watershed, affecting 5 communities downstream and rendering thousands of acres of agricultural land unusable for generations. The most recent research represented his father's proposed solution, a revolutionary approach to mineral extraction that would preserve the mountain's integrity while still accessing the kerylite. He designed a targeted microbore extraction system, Henry said admiringly, examining detailed technical drawings. Instead of blasting and strip mining, it would use precision drilling with specialized equipment to extract small cores of the mineral while leaving surrounding formations intact. The environmental footprint would be minimal compared to standard mining practices. More impressive still was the parallel research into synthetic production. The lab beneath the cabin had been dedicated to replicating the natural formation processes of kerylite under controlled conditions. He was getting closer, Jake realized, reviewing the final entries. The synthetic samples were achieving over 80% of the natural specimen's energy capacity, and the production timeline was accelerating. Sleep eluded Jake that night as he lay on Martha's spare bed, Rusty's warm weight pressed against his side, the dog maintaining his protective vigilance even in rest. Davis's claims about his father working for Vertex plagued him with doubt. The possibility that his father's apparent principles had eventually crumbled under pressure too painful to contemplate, yet impossible to dismiss entirely. The digital clock on the nightstand marked the slow passage of hours as Jake mentally reviewed every piece of information, every clue about his father's character and actions. The laboratory's sophisticated security, the hidden research sites, the meticulous documentation all spoke of a man committed to protecting his discovery rather than surrendering it. Yet families had been leveraged before, principles sacrificed for loved ones. Dawn found Jake sitting on the porch steps, watching as first light painted the distant ridgelines in soft gold. The mountains stood as they had for millennia, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding across their ancient surfaces. The beauty and permanence of the landscape provided perspective that had been missing in his narrower view. These mountains sustained ecosystems, communities, and watersheds across 5 counties, their existence interwoven with thousands of lives beyond his own. His father had recognized this interconnection, had understood that personal gain at the cost of widespread destruction represented no gain at all. The realization settled over Jake with surprising clarity, burning away the fog of resentment and confusion that had clouded his judgment. Whatever his father's current situation, his initial choice to protect the kerylite discovery had been born of genuine conviction rather than stubbornness or scientific pride. Martha found him there as the morning brightened, settling beside him with the familiar creak of aging joints. "You've made your decision," she observed, reading his expression with the wisdom of her years. Jake nodded, the certainty of his choice evident in his posture. "I'm going to find Lab Omega and finish what he started. Even if Vertex has him, they don't have his complete research or the natural deposit location. Without those, they can't move forward." Martha studied him with a mixture of pride and concern. "It won't be easy or safe. Davis isn't a man who makes idle threats." She hesitated, seeming to come to her own decision about something long considered. "There's something I've been keeping for you, waiting for the right moment. I believe that time has come." From her apron pocket, she withdrew an envelope, worn at the edges from years of careful storage. "Your father left this with me before he disappeared, made me promise to give it to you if you ever returned to the cabin and showed signs of following his research. I've carried it with me every day since, waiting for you to be ready." The coordinates from his father's map led them deep into the forest, following game trails that hadn't seen human traffic in years. Henry moved with surprising agility for his age, reading the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades navigating the mountain wilderness. The location proved to be a natural cave concealed behind a dense growth of rhododendrons, its entrance further disguised by carefully arranged rocks that would appear random to casual observation. Inside, protected from the elements and hidden from searching eyes, they discovered a large, waterproof trunk secured with a combination lock. The numbers from the map opened it easily, revealing contents that demonstrated Robert Miller's meticulous planning. The trunk contained emergency supplies, a significant amount of cash in various denominations, a prepaid satellite phone, and a sealed waterproof document case. Most valuable was a comprehensive letter, pages long and dated just weeks before his disappearance, clearly intended as both explanation and guide should circumstances align as they now had. Jake read it aloud by lantern light, his father's words filling the cave with an almost tangible presence. "My son, if you're reading this, then several things have happened. You've returned to the cabin, discovered the Kerulite, and chosen to protect it rather than surrender it to those who would exploit it regardless of consequences. I prepared this contingency knowing that Vertex would eventually approach you as they did me, with offers too generous to be legitimate and threats too dangerous to ignore." The letter continued with personal messages that brought tears to Jake's eyes, apologies for missed birthdays and absent guidance during crucial years. Expressions of pride in the young man Martha had described in her occasional updates. "Know that leaving you and your mother was the most painful decision of my life, one I've questioned every day since. I hope someday you can understand, if not forgive." Robert detailed his movements after disappearing, how he had established multiple research sites across 3 states, working under assumed names while continuing the Kerulite research. "I maintained contact with only 2 colleagues from my university days, Dr. Eleanor Winters in the Geological Engineering Department and Dr. James Chen in Materials Science. Eleanor holds critical research components I couldn't risk keeping with me, specifically the advanced molecular stabilization protocols for synthetic production. Without these, the synthetic Kerulite remains too unstable for practical application." The journey to Westridge University required careful planning to avoid Vertex surveillance. They left Martha's property before dawn, taking back roads in Henry's ancient truck while Rusty rode in the cab between them, alert to every passing vehicle. Jake carried only essential items, the cash and satellite phone from his father's cache secured in hidden pockets, the most critical research notes and samples concealed in a worn backpack that attracted no attention. The 3-hour drive stretched to 5 as Henry took circuitous routes, doubling back occasionally to ensure they weren't followed. Despite their precautions, Jake noticed a silver sedan appearing at consistent intervals, always several cars behind but maintaining their general direction through multiple highway changes. "We've picked up a tail," he murmured to Henry, who nodded almost imperceptibly, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "Been with us since the county line. Professional, keeping good distance." The old man exited unexpectedly at a busy truck stop, pulling alongside a row of semis where their vehicle was momentarily hidden. "Out now," he instructed, passing Jake a baseball cap. "Cut through the restaurant, exit through the kitchen." Delivery truck leaving East Side in 3 minutes. Driver's an old friend. He'll get you the rest of the way. Jake hesitated, reluctant to separate. What about you and Rusty? Henry scratched the dog's ears affectionately. We're the diversion. They'll follow us north while you head east. Safer for everyone this way. The plan worked seamlessly, Jake slipping through the busy truck stop unnoticed while Henry and Rusty departed visibly in the opposite direction. The delivery driver, a weathered man who asked no questions, dropped Jake near the university's science complex by mid-afternoon. Dr. Eleanor Winters' office was located in the Geological Engineering Department's newest building, a modern glass structure that contrasted sharply with the campus's otherwise traditional architecture. Following his father's instructions, Jake approached indirectly, first visiting the Public Geological Museum, where he left a specific reference book open to a marked page at an unattended reading table. The signal established, he waited in the campus coffee shop until closing, when a slender woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun approached his table. The Blue Mountain reveals its secrets only to those who seek harmony rather than dominance, she said quietly, the passphrase from his father's letter confirming her identity. The return journey from the university carried new urgency, with Jake traveling separately from the precious research Dr. Winters had safeguarded. Following her advice, he took a circuitous route back to Pinecrest, using public transportation and switching vehicles frequently to avoid tracking. The satellite phone from his father's cache buzzed as he boarded a rural bus service for the final leg of the journey, Martha's voice tight with controlled fear when he answered, "Don't come back to my place. Meet us at emergency location 3. The designated meeting point was a hunting cabin belonging to an old friend of Henry's, isolated enough to provide temporary sanctuary while they assessed their next moves. Jake arrived after nightfall, guided by memorized directions and the faint glow of light through boarded windows. Inside, he found Martha sitting rigidly at a rough wooden table, her usual calm shattered by evident distress. Henry paced near the fireplace, his weathered face drawn with tension as Rusty watched them both with canine concern. "Vertex teams swarmed my property 2 hours after you left for the university," Martha explained, hands trembling slightly around a tin mug of tea. "They had search warrants citing suspected environmental violations, timed perfectly to coincide with your absence. They knew exactly when you'd be gone." Henry's expression hardened as he joined them at the table. "They've been one step behind us consistently, but this was different. They knew specifics that weren't public knowledge, including details about the university contact. Someone's been feeding them information, someone close to us." Jake's mind raced through possibilities, considering everyone who knew about their movements. The list was deliberately short: Martha, Henry, Connor, who had driven him into town, and Dr. Winters. "We need to figure out who the mole is before we make another move." Jake began, but Henry interrupted with unexpected sharpness. "Already know who it is. Been suspecting for weeks but confirmed it this afternoon." The old man's voice cracked with emotion. "It's Connor, Martha's nephew. Found him on a burner phone behind my workshop, reporting your university trip details to someone. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it." The old moonshine tunnel opened into a ravine thick with mountain laurel, providing immediate cover as Jake emerged with Rusty padding silently beside him. Distant shouts echoed from the direction of the cabin, flashlight beams cutting through the trees as Vertex security teams established a perimeter. Jake hesitated, torn between escaping with the research and attempting to help Martha and Henry, when the sound of approaching footsteps forced his decision. A security team was sweeping toward his position, their tactical lights illuminating the forest floor just yards away. Rusty sensed the danger, remaining perfectly still beside Jake as they pressed deeper into the undergrowth. The map from his father's letter guided their retreat, leading them along forgotten hunting trails that wound higher into the mountains. His father had marked these paths with subtle signs, small arrangements of stones or notches in specific trees that would mean nothing to casual observers, but created a navigable route for those who knew to look for them. They traveled through the night, putting miles between themselves and the hunting cabin, climbing steadily into remote terrain where vehicles couldn't follow. Dawn found them resting briefly on a ridgeline that offered views across the valley, the first golden light revealing the breathtaking scale of the wilderness his father had dedicated his life to protecting. Ancient forests carpeted the slopes in vibrant green, morning mist curling through valleys where streams caught the sunlight like silver threads woven through the landscape. The mountain air carried scents of pine and wildflowers, cleaner and sharper than anything Jake had experienced in years of city living. A hawk circled lazily on thermal currents overhead, its freedom a stark contrast to the human conflicts unfolding below. Jake consulted his father's map, identifying the distinctive peak that marked their next objective. The route would take them near the Blue Mountain Formation itself, the geological marvel containing the K'Rulite deposit that had set everything in motion. Rusty alerted first to the sound of helicopter rotors, the distant thudding growing louder as a black aircraft appeared over a neighboring ridge. They ducked beneath a rock outcropping, watching as the helicopter made systematic passes across the terrain, clearly conducting a coordinated search pattern. Morning light filtered through cracks in the cave entrance as Jake examined the contents of a waterproof case hidden beneath a loose stone in the cave floor. Inside lay his father's final research journal, its pages filled with increasingly excited notes documenting the breakthrough that had eluded him for years. Molecular replication, achieved at 97% efficiency, one entry read, dated just 3 months earlier. Synthetic K'Rulite crystals now demonstrate energy capacity matching natural specimens, with enhanced stability during rapid charge-discharge cycles. Jake studied the detailed formulas and process descriptions, recognizing their significance through the knowledge he'd gained from Dr. Winters and Henry. His father had solved the fundamental challenge, creating laboratory conditions that mimicked the geological processes that had formed the natural deposit over millions of years. The synthesis method required sophisticated equipment but relied on common base elements rather than rare minerals, making large-scale production feasible without environmental destruction. Most remarkably, his father had designed the process to be energy efficient, avoiding the massive carbon footprint that typically accompanied synthetic material production. The K'Rulite solution. His father had titled the final section, outlining applications beyond energy storage that included medical imaging, water purification, and radiation shielding. The combined patents would revolutionize multiple industries simultaneously, creating value that dwarfed even the immense worth of the natural deposit. The journal's final pages revealed the moral framework that had guided his father's work. The technology represents too much potential power to entrust to any single entity, corporate or governmental, he'd written. Distributed development through open-source protocols with strategic patent protections for environmental applications ensures no monopoly can form. His father had created a legal structure through trusted attorneys that would release the synthesis method to multiple research institutions simultaneously, preventing any single organization from controlling the technology while ensuring its benefits reached humanity broadly. Jake realized this framework was why Vertex pursued the natural deposit so aggressively. The corporation sought to establish control before the synthetic alternative became widely available, securing mining rights that would become exponentially valuable if they could delay or prevent the release of his father's research. Rusty's alert posture drew Jake's attention to sounds outside the cave. Voices carried on the mountain air as search teams coordinated their movements through the terrain. They were methodically sweeping the area, closing in on the network of caves marked on publicly available geological surveys. Soon they would discover this location. The journey back to Pinecrest required careful navigation through Forest Service land, avoiding main trails and roads where Vertex teams maintained checkpoints. Jake and Rusty emerged from the wilderness 3 days later, thin and exhausted but carrying the complete research that could change everything. Frank Townsend, the former mayor, provided temporary sanctuary in his home on the outskirts of town, his long-standing opposition to Vertex making him a natural ally. Martha and Henry are being held at the Vertex field office, Frank reported grimly. They're calling it protective custody while investigating eco-terrorism threats, but nobody's allowed to see them. The small living room gradually filled with trusted community members. Sarah Jenkins, the school teacher, Thomas Reed, the former Vertex employee, several small business owners, and farmers whose lands bordered the watershed. All had suffered from Vertex's presence and brought pieces of information that, combined with Jake's evidence, revealed the corporation's systematic campaign of intimidation, environmental violations, and legal manipulation. Sarah's classroom technology enabled them to document everything, creating a comprehensive digital record of Vertex's activities, including illegal water sampling results Thomas had secretly copied before quitting. They've exceeded allowable contamination levels in 17 separate tests, Thomas explained, but falsified reports to the state environmental agency. Most damning was evidence of Vertex's security teams operating beyond their property, conducting warrantless searches and surveillance of local residents. Jake carefully presented selected portions of his father's research, explaining the synthetic alternative without revealing its complete methodology. My father developed a way to create these minerals in a laboratory, he explained, displaying a synthetic K-rylite sample that glowed with inner fire beneath the living room lights. This technology makes destroying the mountain completely unnecessary, but Vertex has been suppressing this knowledge to protect their mining interests. The black convoy of luxury vehicles arrived the following morning, parking prominently in front of the Pinecrest Town Hall where an emergency council meeting had been called. William Davis emerged first, his usual corporate smile replaced with tight-lipped determination as he held the door for a distinguished silver-haired man whose expensive suit and commanding presence immediately identified him as someone accustomed to power. Edward Chambers, Frank whispered to Jake as they watched from across the street, CEO of Vertex's parent company. He doesn't leave the corporate headquarters for minor situations. The town hall filled beyond capacity, residents standing along walls and spilling onto the sidewalk outside where speakers had been hastily installed to accommodate the overflow crowd. Jake sat at a folding table alongside Frank and Sarah, their evidence organized before them, while across the aisle Chambers and his executive team arranged themselves with practiced precision, leather portfolios and digital presentations at the ready. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order with visible nervousness, the small-town official clearly intimidated by the corporate presence. Chambers spoke first, his deep voice carrying effortless authority as he expressed grave concern over misinformation being spread about Vertex's operations. "We've invested millions in this community," he stated, gesturing toward glossy economic impact reports being distributed by assistants. "Our environmental protocols exceed federal requirements, creating sustainable extraction that balances economic growth with conservation." The corporate presentation continued with impressive visualizations of promised facilities and job creation projections, emphasizing economic benefits while minimizing ecological impacts through carefully selected statistics and technical jargon designed to overwhelm the average listener. When Jake's turn came, Chambers interrupted before he could begin. "Before Mr. Miller presents his perspective, this council should know the source of these allegations." He nodded to Davis, who distributed documents to council members. Robert Miller was dismissed from his university position for ethical violations involving research misappropriation. His subsequent paranoia and erratic behavior are well documented in psychiatric evaluations. Murmurs spread through the crowd as Jake absorbed the unexpected attack. Davis continued relentlessly, "Like father, like son. Jacob Miller has demonstrated the same disturbing patterns, trespassing on Vertex property, stealing corporate research materials, and making scientifically unsupportable claims about alternative technologies." The corporate team's strategy became clear, discrediting both Jake and his father to undermine their evidence before it could be presented. "I appreciate Vertex's offer," Jake began, his voice steady despite the pressure of the moment, "but I must decline." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as he continued. "My father didn't develop this technology to create personal wealth or corporate profit, but to ensure that energy innovation could proceed without environmental destruction. he outlined his alternative vision: the establishment of the Blue Mountain Research Foundation, an independent nonprofit dedicated to developing and implementing the synthetic kaolite technology. The foundation would be governed by a board including scientific experts, environmental advocates, and community representatives, ensuring balanced decision-making that considered all stakeholders. Limited extraction from the natural deposit will fund initial operations, Jake explained, using only the sustainable microbore technology my father developed, with strict environmental monitoring and absolute protection of the watershed. Dr. Winters stepped forward to provide scientific validation, confirming that such limited extraction could proceed without ecological damage while the synthetic production scaled to commercial levels. The foundation's structure would make the core technology open source for energy applications while maintaining strategic patents that prevented monopolistic control. This ensures the benefits reach humanity broadly rather than enriching a single corporation, Jake explained, directly addressing Chambers' earlier arguments. And it honors the community that supported this discovery from the beginning. The proposal included establishing Pinecrest as the foundation's headquarters, creating sustainable jobs in research and production rather than temporary extraction positions. Local landowners would receive fair compensation for limited access without surrendering their properties, maintaining the community's character while improving its economic prospects. As Jake concluded, spontaneous applause erupted from the community members present, their support visible and vocal. Chambers' expression remained carefully neutral, but Davis whispered urgently in his ear, calculating the shifting public relations landscape. State officials nodded approvingly at the balanced approach that protected environmental interests while promoting economic development within their jurisdiction. The renovated cabin gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its weathered logs preserved while modern solar panels captured energy that powered the expanded research facility now surrounding it. The Blue Mountain Research Center had transformed the isolated property into a hub of sustainable technology development, employing dozens of local residents and hosting scientists from universities worldwide. Jake walked the perimeter path, Rusty trotting faithfully beside him, both older and wiser than they had been that snowy day when they first discovered the stones beneath the floorboards. Inside the main laboratory, synthetic kaolite production had reached commercial scale, the glowing blue crystals now powering communities across 3 states through partnerships with renewable energy providers. The watershed remained pristine, protected by the Foundation's conservation easements that extended across thousands of acres surrounding the original deposit. Jake's father had not been at the facility where authorities had expected to find him. The search continued, though with diminishing hope as months passed without concrete leads. Yet Robert Miller's presence remained palpable in the research center that bore his name and the technology that realized his vision. Jake had made peace with the possibility that he might never see his father again, finding closure in continuing the work that had meant everything to him. Martha approached along the path, moving more slowly now but still sharp-minded and determined. As the Foundation's community liaison, she ensured local interests remained central to all decisions, healing the divisions Vertex's presence had created. The tour group from the governor's office just arrived. She reminded him gently. They're particularly interested in the educational outreach program. Jake nodded, taking one last moment to appreciate the scene before heading inside. The Foundation's latest initiative would bring students from across the state to learn about sustainable technology and environmental preservation, ensuring the next generation understood both the value of innovation and the importance of responsible stewardship.